Yes.
Conference is like, we just do everything during one. We meet once a week. We have our Tuesday night meetings, and then we have our one.
We have our one-on-ones, that's separate from our program. And she wants us everyone present.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, we just did that. I get put in all that sort of chat. I've already told Tasha, I haven't told her at this point because I'm staying here for summer and being a summer. I will just keep you through anyway.
All right, let's go ahead and get started for today. I know we're a smaller group. We have a number of folks who need to isolate, or also folks that have travel going on this week for athletics and so on. Just as a reminder, as I shared yesterday through Canvas, if you do find yourself in exposure for COVID and you do need to self-isolate, make sure that you're going through student affairs to do that, right? They're the folks to contact so that you can go through the isolation process in an official capacity and get that paperwork out for your classes. Please also remember, right, you're welcome to join us through Zoom if you can't participate face-to-face. And if you can't participate face-to-face or through Zoom, that I have the recordings posted after class. You can do the makeup assignments and catch up on things that you missed. So also, now that we're in week 2, by the end of this week, I'm asking you to turn in your second week activity or your second week quiz that goes over the readings from this week. And then we do have next Monday off for MLK Day. So our next class meeting is not going to be until next Wednesday. I believe that's the 9th. So to get us started for today, I just want to do a couple quick reviews and then we'll work through some things and then we'll do a group activity for today that applies some of the ideas that we've been talking about this week. We've talked a lot this week about group membership. What does it mean to be a part of a group? And how do members of a group behave and interact with one another, including roles? So we talked last class about the first writing assignment. Again, it's short, it's only 2 pages, but it does ask you to think about a group that you're a part of, currently a member of. We also talked about group membership roles, including Belbin's self-perception inventory, and the way that things like status and trust can shape groups. As a reminder, the group membership reflection is an assignment you can access through Canvas. On that Canvas page, I have the link to the assignment, and I also have the prompt and rubric that you can access. So I definitely recommend, again, giving that a look, starting to brainstorm and come up with what you need to do to complete that. And it's due on the 26th. So it's there under week 3. And then you can click here to access the rubric and all of the assignment information there. So that's that assignment. And again, I'm happy to look at rough drafts, outlines, and so on. I also recommend using Purdue OWL or EOU Writing Center, who can provide you with some tips about how to cite and include those formal sources. Remember, and I'm not going to go through all these again, but the Belbin self-perception inventory, as we talked about last class, and I asked you to think about in groups, right, deals with these different types of categories and how you might have a particular role or multiple roles depending on the groups that you're a part of. A lot of people mentioned having a co-coordinator or leadership type role by circumstance, like everybody else is sick or not able to attend. So we're not necessarily locked into a single role, but these can oftentimes change over time. We also talked about both status and trust. Status being your reputation, including a formal title or the experience that you have with the group, and trust being this thing that you can develop over time through your engagement and your participation. Does anybody have any questions about anything we talked about last class, the first writing assignment, or anything else? Great. So for this class, we're going to be talking a little bit about culture and media, the ways that those can impact communication. And then we'll be spending most of the class doing a kind of fun survival activity that's a chance for us to apply and use ideas in small group communication. So one idea that I think is important, you might be familiar with this if you've taken a class like interpersonal or intercultural communication, is the role of context, right? You can think about context in terms of if you're going to talk to a friend and they're gearing up and they're really anxious about a job interview, right? You know that they have an interview going on, and as a result of that, they're going to be less present and dealing with their own set of challenges, right? So context matters because you're not going to flood them with a bunch of information if they're really stressed out and anxious. You know when you adapt your own communication to that situation. So context is important when we're communicating among members of a group that come from different backgrounds, right? We can think about context as a spectrum, with lower context cultures being ones such as the United States and Australia, and higher context cultures being countries such as China and Japan. One of the major differences in context, right, is that higher context cultures tend to be more populous countries, such as, again, Japan and China. There's a lot more people, and as a result, there's a lot more norms and a much greater emphasis on creating harmony among members of the group. So low context cultures like the United States, there tends to be greater emphasis on saying what you mean, right? The idea that communication should be direct and straightforward. If somebody's trying to sell you something and you don't want it, you say no or no thank you, right? You are very clear about what it is that you do and don't want. Whereas in more high context cultures, there is less of a focus on speaking directly and articulating as much information as possible, and more focus on nonverbal communication, on gestures, on facial expressions, and so on. So rather than saying no, if somebody sells you something, you might say maybe, or I'm not so sure, or something that's a little more hesitant, because that's a cultural norm that's seen as more respectful. So one challenge in communicating in a group effectively is thinking about how culture and how the different styles of communication and levels of directness are used. So context matters, including cultural context for communication. Another key idea is the concept of code switching, right? So for folks that are bilingual, right, or might be fluent in the language, sometimes they might intersperse or sprinkle in elements of one language into another for conversation, right? Code switching is a common strategy that can be used when people are adapting to communicating in different ways. For instance, right, we in the United States in English tend to use a lot of appropriation and language from other cultures, right? For instance, we use a lot of Greek and Latin roots for the English language, but we also will incorporate words from other cultures. For instance, the term umami to describe like the taste and sensation of food is not from the US, but also the way that we talk about and incorporate language such as German language, like Schadenfreude, right, which means taking pleasure in the suffering of others, is a term that would be an example of code switching. So this is something that, again, also depending on what dominant language is, can look really different, right? So for instance, a lot of languages and sort of different types of dialects and ways of speaking from a lot of historically underrepresented populations, right, could be very different than a like company or group setting that's a lot wider, right? So there's a lot of challenges that come about in the way that things like race, ethnicity, and identity play into communication. Another key idea here is the idea of self-disclosure, right? The idea that self-disclosure is kind of like opening a box. If the box is you and different parts about you, right? And one of the challenges to communicating effectively in a small group is to think about what's appropriate and what makes sense to take out of the box. So if you're working with a small group and you're trying to come up with, a new advertisement or commercial, right? You're not going to tell everybody your life story and get into this like really long discussion about your ex, right? That would be appropriate and wouldn't make sense to that situation. So self-disclosure is about making careful, thoughtful decisions about what you choose to share with other people, right? Because on the other end of the equation, if you don't share anything and people don't know you at all, they're not going to feel comfortable or safe around you. One idea we talk about in interpersonal communication is the idea of social penetration theory, right? It's like layers of an onion. We have these early outside layers. We just share basic information about each other to other people, like our name, where we're from, and so on. Our intermediate layer shares things like our social, political views, music, and movies we like. And then the sort of core and central layer is about the values and beliefs that are incredibly important to us. Maybe you really want to grow up or already grown up and want to be a musician, right? That goal and that drive could be something you disclose. So self-disclosure and figuring out how to do so appropriately is really important. Another consideration, right, is the role of digital groups. So we've seen this really explode in the last couple of years, obviously through Zoom, but we've also seen different forms of online communication. Discord, which is a platform used originally for gaming, but for a lot of different channels of communication. Folks mentioned Snapchat, group texts, and so on. So there's a lot of potential there, right? And a lot of opportunities that come through digital groups, but also a lot of challenges that such groups bring to the table, right? So one thing to think about is that in digital groups, there are parts of communication that are missed, right? Because we don't have the 3D space, because you don't see nonverbal communication in the same way, if it's just audio or just text, or it's within a 2D space, it'd be a lot more challenging. For instance, studies have found that the reason that we oftentimes get exhausted through things like Zoom meetings is because our brains are working overdrive trying to find all the little nonverbal signals and elements of communication as we're looking through all those Brady Bunch boxes, right? With everybody speaking and trying to understand the message. So there's definitely a lot of constraints and challenges, but in a lot of professional applied settings, we do have to use digital communication, at least to some degree. Knowing and being careful about the norms of the group is really important. For instance, if there's like a Discord channel that's really focused on playing Skyrim, right, and about playing that game, then, and you come in talking about a totally different game or topic, it's not going to be very appropriate to the norms or behavior of that group, right? A lot of online channels will have different rules for moderators, right, who are designed to enforce those rules and ensure that it's in compliance with the communication happening. Gender, of course, plays a role in how groups communicate. In fact, gender is not in small group communication something that's like biologically hard-coded, men do this, women do this, right? It's more that society and culture has oftentimes stereotyped or cast us into different roles. Oftentimes, right, there are stereotypes that men are more action-oriented listeners, and women are more people-oriented listeners, but there's a lot of ways that that's not the case. Empathy is important too, right? Thinking about how your communication impacts, especially in a small group. Being careful about humor, right? Oftentimes, the tone or style of your message gets lost online, especially with sarcasm, right? Sometimes, in fact, people will use like /s to indicate sarcasm if they're messaging online. And if you've ever scrolled to the comments section, right, you know that things like blaming, personal attacks, and so on can be a really big problem. Catfishing, right, is pretending to be somebody else online. There's even a TV show about it, right, that shows examples of people showing false information online. So these are definitely some of the challenges and perils that we can encounter when we're using online communication in groups. As I mentioned earlier, right, one core idea here of how groups communicate, including online, deals with media richness theory. Media richness theory sort of views media that we use as a spectrum, ranging from lean to very rich media. On the very kind of lean end, you have something like an email, right? If you're going through your email and you're reading messages or you're reading texts, it's not very engaged. You're not participating a whole lot, right? Your brain's not very active. Things like social media are a little bit more lively. Then you get into voice, video, and on the other extreme, face-to-face, right? Media is richer when it engages with more senses. The more senses it does, right, the more we can understand a message and all the little parts of it, right? Because rich media is generally more interesting, more engaging, more thoughtful. So what I'm going to have us do now is a kind of fun activity that'll ask us to apply some of the ideas we've talked about so far in the corner related to group membership and group participation. I mentioned that one of your assignments in the class is going to be sort of reflecting on group activities that we've been doing in the class. This is an example of one of them. So I'm going to show you what I'm asking you to do for this one. And then after that, I'll be breaking you off into groups in order to work on this activity as a whole. So let me go ahead and pull this up for you on Canvas. So this is a group activity that actually comes from the US military. It's kind of a fun way to think about survival and what to do. So you and your companions have just survived the crash of a small plane. Both the pilot and co-pilot were killed in the crash. It's mid-January and you're in northern Canada. Daily temperature is 25 degrees below zero. Nighttime temperature is 40 degrees below zero. There's snow on the ground and the countryside is wooded with several creeks. The nearest town is 20 miles away. You're dressed in city clothes for a business meeting. And your group of survivors have managed to get the following items: ball of steel wool, small axe, a loaded .45 caliber pistol, can of Crisco shortening, newspapers, one per person, a cigarette lighter, doesn't have fluid, extra shirt and pants for everybody, 20 by 20 piece of heavy duty canvas, a sectional air map made of plastic, a quart of 100 proof whiskey, a compass, and family sized chocolate bars. So your goal as a group is to list out the 12 items here in order of importance. And your group has to come together and agree about the different tools and why you're ranking them the way that you are, right? So there has to be an agreement among the group as a whole. And you can have one person per group who can either write or type the list, and then you'll be turning that in for your attendance credit for the day. So what I'll do then is give you some groups to work on this activity with. Let me also share this so that the recording is up for later. So let's do, we have 5, 6, 7, 8. So let's do 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So we'll have 2 groups. I will give you 20 minutes to talk amongst each other and come up with your ranked list. Please write or type your ranked list along with everybody in your group on that. So your 20 minutes starts now.
I would say that 20 miles is not very far. Yeah, not very far.
Turn in a group.
Yes, one per group. So your group should come together and figure out a list together.
I'd say it is cold, so like trouble might be slow. But I mean, that's at least, that's only 2 days.
We just have to rank the 12 items.
Yes, one per group.
What's that?
Yeah, for sure.
You'd be sending the direction.
Yeah.
Since it is in there.
No pass.
It's like.
Yeah. What's an air map?
What would you say is your?
So an air map would be like a map of from the sky, the surrounding area and landscape.
That's what it shows. Probably that.
And they didn't say when the plane crashed, so we could assume it crashed at 4 a.m.
Yes.
So then we would have.
Yeah, because I mean, 20 miles is definitely.
So I said we put compass on
Since
we've gone overnight, we would want to try.
Yeah.
that. Yeah,
actually,
clothes are important.
clothes and food is for energy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You see,
And the whiskey as well. We had 24. Yeah.
So we got the compass, the clothes, the whiskey.
It's almost like a tarp.
yeah.
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah. Here in Canada. It's 40.
Got the gun.
It's almost like
Tags could be pretty useful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Help clear like branches and stuff. for the truck as well.
And then we had stuff ready to go with the 20 by 20.
Yeah.
And then we could make shelter. Yeah.
Same one night. So we shelter.
Maybe we
Some
just paper
paper.
small.
And fire out of that.
Sure, fire.
I already know we can get a cigarette lighter. That fluid. You get a spark.
Yeah, it's part of it.
Balls to a wall. Close out.
It's the steel wool on the axe, though. Not the back of the-
Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty flammable too. That's straight up. Straight up.
So we all agree it goes
Right.
compass, map, the clothes. Then probably the gun, the axe, and the food, the whiskey. And a lot of probably like the cigarette lighter, steel wool. They're just kind of the fire things. It is depends like client, mine is to wait.
But 20 you could do. You're one.
Yeah, so
A
that's
lot of pain. That sounds good to me.
yeah.
Yeah.
Stuffing your hand and clothes.
Yeah.
So
And then the compass is that.
What's this with also?
Yeah, one new.
So the first thing was.
I think compass. Third is the.
maybe clothing.
Yeah, that's fine. That's what I'm driving.
Or.
Let's see, probably food, truck,
Yeah.
Crisco, whiskey, just any order.
I would say.
Probably gun.
Fire stuff, lighter, paper, steel wool.
20 by 20.
Fire that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not. Steel stuff. At most one night.
I can get, I guess you can get like Las Vegas, it's like it's. The direction you're walking.
Yeah, it's just.
It will be a total.
Oh, a few. It's a few.
Yeah, we got compass here now. Clothing, Crisco, gun, axe, we did reverse the wall.
That's basically.
This is gonna be super helpful. Chunk of that.
As you're working on and finalizing, you might think about what your overall strategy is, right? Are you just trying to hunker down and stay there until help arrives? Are you trying to book it and get out of there?
Never said some plane crash.
Stuff to some other places. Snow.
Yeah.
Starts in the morning.
Sounds like most of the flat land. That's an increase. Saying that we can access it. Clears about the way.
This is the one. This one never gets. Right here we are anyways, so.
All right. How are our groups doing? Do folks need some additional time or are you feeling pretty good?
Very good.
Okay. So go ahead and wrap up and then I'll ask among the two groups to have somebody that shares your list. All right, so why don't we start with this group here on this side. So go ahead and share your list and also like what your group saw as the overall strategy based on that list.
All right, so our plan was to try to make it like the day or 1 day, 24 hours or so. So our big plans were like Compass 1, the air map 2, clothing, then the Crisco, the whiskey, the chocolate bar, either interchangeable, I'd say. Then we designed the gun for wildlife just in case, and the axe, newspaper, steel wool, and the lighter for a fire when we do. And then it does get to that goal. And then the 20 by 20 canvas.
Okay, cool. It's interesting to see, you know, your strategy is like getting through a day, right? And that's sort of immediate survival. Seems like a, you know, makes sense as an approach, and also that you've chosen a lot of the items that would be designed to help you with that, like in the moment survival for sure. You four over here.
Our plan was very similar to them, but if you're walking through deep snow, you're not going to be able to even travel 10 miles in a day. So our first goal was snowshoes to be able to walk further on top of snow, so you're not having to walk through that and get your feet all wet and cold and wet. So we were looking at stuff to make like snowshoes pretty easily.
All right.
So number one was actually the axe to get like wood and stuff like that,
Okay.
as well as like make like little tools, and then the canvas as well to help make shoes. And then we're also looking at stuff that would like help keep us warm, because we're probably gonna have to be over there over at night at that point, because 20 miles is a lot to do in a day. So we said stuff like the lighter, and then compass to help us travel. The can of Crisco we put pretty high up because we figured you could empty it out because there's the fresh streams nearby, and you could use it almost as like a water bottle as well as the whiskey. So we have those both pretty high. The whiskey can also use it as a fire starter, steel wool fire starter. The sectional air map can also be used as like a bottom for the snowshoes and stuff like that, because that's got some pretty good surface area to it, and then the extra clothes and stuff to make like backpacks or some kind of way to carry the extra luggage. And then chocolate bars, 45 the newspaper kind of look. The chocolate bars they're gonna get consumed pretty quick to get your calories for like to make the push for the one day. And then 45 the newspaper, because the newspaper once it gets wet, it's kind of useless. So unless you can keep it dry, it's not really gonna be all that useful to you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I really like the way that you all work together to find, okay, getting shoes, including snowshoes in this is a really big priority. And so how can we work backwards to find like the items that would help to make that happen? Seems like an interesting goal and seems like it really kind of informed a slightly different list there. So glad you all got to share that and talk through that order of priority too. So there's actually a ranking that was made by Mark Wanvig, former instructor in survival training in the US Army, who, again, depending on the group and its goals, it might look a little bit different, but he has his own ranking for why he places these things the way that he does. He thinks that a lot of this is going to be really challenging from freezing and exhaustion, and the goal is to attract the attention of search planes immediately. So interestingly, the ranking that he came up with at the top is the cigarette lighter that's designed to deal with creating fire, creating sparks, and dealing with cold. The second one, the ball of steel wool to catch sparks and also to get attention, like from a rescue plane. Extra shirt and pants to keep warm for shelter. Then the Crisco shortening. I think this one's always really silly. The Crisco shortening could be used to create like a mirror signaling device from the lid, generating sunlight and shining the lid. Other things would be rubbing it on exposed skin to protect from the cold, melting it in an oil for fuel, melting snow with the empty can to drink water, and so on. So there's some interesting uses there. And we have the canvas for making shelter, protection, the small axe for wood, the chocolate bars for some energy, newspapers for starting a fire, the pistol for a sound signaling device. One kind of funny thing that gets brought up though is that the pistol might not be a good idea because of like the panic and fear that you might have as a survivor and it creating the risk that somebody could get hurt or killed. So that could hurt the overall cohesion of the group. The whiskey for fire building and a torch, but also that like getting drunk obviously is going to create increased risk of hypothermia. The compass might be a problem because it might be used to try to get somebody to walk in a certain direction and break up from the group. And then air map at the bottom because it might encourage people to walk to the nearest town. Some interesting thing from that list, right, is that there's a concern from some of the items like the map and the compass that it might divide the group and create some problems. So that was kind of funny and kind of interesting to see that perspective too on why the ranking was the way that it was, right? So I want to talk through a couple of the reasons that I had us do this activity and some of the goals that I hope that you kind of take away from this, right? One of the first goals and sort of guiding questions, right, is why your group decided on this list the way that you did. So for instance, you have a person in a lot of situations who served as a note taker who's collecting ideas, who might have been in that co-coordinator leadership type of role, right? You all also decided on the list in terms of the goals or the strategy. Again, both of you, both groups really were concerned with creating this immediate survival and getting through the day, but some of the specifics were different, right? Like creating snowshoes was seen as really important versus, trying to create shelter. What role you found yourself in as a part of the group, right? So I noticed that there were a few people who were kind of in this plant role where they were bringing up like the concerns about wildlife, or they were bringing up the concerns about the snow and being able to walk in the weather. And we're able to add those ideas to the table and help the group come up with a list with those concerns in mind, right? In my other class, I had a couple of folks who had a lot of experience with like hunting and camping and a lot of time outdoors who brought like more ideas to the table, but depending on your own experience with things like wilderness and survival, right? You're coming in with different ideas, maybe different concerns you could bring into the group's overall consideration, right? In the same way that things like culture, identity, and so on shape what people bring to the table in a situation. And then similarities and differences. Again, there was a kind of shared agreement about the focus on immediate survival. But you might have come into this, you were working on this activity on your own with a different goal, maybe to get out of there, to walk away, and to try to find the nearest town, or to focus on trying to create a signal. So you might think about in activities like this, right? You get this task, you're focused on survival, and the way you see survival happening, whether it's getting somebody to find you and pick you up, whether it's going to the nearest town, so on, could look very, very good. So again, it helps us to see some of the ways things like norms, behavior, and so on are a little bit different in different groups. So I know we're a smaller group for today, and you all seem like we're able to work through this activity pretty efficiently. So we will wrap up a little bit earlier for today. I know it's been a long week. So to wrap up the main ideas and thoughts that we've been over for today, right? We talked about some of the ways that culture and goals can shape how small groups communicate. Again, culture differing in terms of its context from low to high, the amount of subtext and information that's beneath the surface. Also, we talked about things like online and digital communication. Again, we're using a lot more platforms like Google Hangouts, Discord, even Snapchat, right? And those can be great, but also when you're in a group, there's more ambiguity. And when there's fewer like sensory ways of communicating, like audio and physical space, then it can be a lot harder for messages to be understood. And we talked about how group roles, small group communication connect, including some of the roles that you might have found yourself in as you were working through this activity. So we don't meet next week, but we have our next class meeting on Wednesday. We'll be getting into some of the ways that we listen in groups. So talk about listening practices, how to understand, how to engage in a group, and also some of the challenges that come from listening when you have a pretty large set of people with a lot of ideas and perspectives. So thanks for your participation and work this week. You're welcome to either email me or pass forward your group's activity for the day. Have a great weekend, and I will see you again on Wednesday. So enjoy the long weekend break.